We are joined today by David Williams. He's a senior technical product manager at Expedia. He's been there for a little over 3 years and was integral in their adoption of Stash. And he's joined by Chris Pepe, who's a partner and senior manager at Perforce Consulting. And he's spoken at our summit events before, but he's probably best known for configuring Jira to pour beer. So if you're interested in learning about that, be sure to grab him after his talk. So thanks so much, guys, and take it away.
Thanks for having us. So as you said, I'm Christopher Pepe. I'm from Perforce Consulting. So we help our clients implement all the different Atlassian tools. We're really process-centric. This, I think, was actually a really good example of kind of like a best practice project for how a consulting organization and a client can work together. We came in, we worked with David, and we have Tammy in the audience here. We had a really tight relationship, and we worked really closely with them all throughout the entire project. So it was a really good partnership from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, and I'm Dave Williams, as Eileen mentioned, from Expedia. You probably all have heard of Expedia. Of course, we're the world's largest online travel agency, and our technology does power 10,000 other customers through our Expedia affiliate network. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll talk a little bit about where we began in our migration to Stash. Mm-hmm. Expedia, of course, as most of you know, spun off of Microsoft several years ago. And coming from Microsoft, we were very Perforce centric in our version control system. We had a lot of tools built up around Perforce. We had a lot of expertise with Perforce. And if there's any of you from Perforce in the audience right now, don't worry, we still love you. But over time, obviously, people became dependent upon these tools. And over time, as we grew bigger, we grew into a global organization. We started to expand. People wanted to explore new technologies. People wanted to do different things. And so you kind of get the idea of, we have all this technical debt built up, and this is how we needed to take, these are the steps we needed to take to move forward in our organization. So maybe a few years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago or so, we had something called a remote developer productivity survey. And this survey basically talked to our developers offshore in different countries, even in our satellite offices, to find out what their problems were. How can they be faster? How can they work faster? And we discovered that if we moved to Git, or a distributed version control system of that type, we could actually save developers maybe up to 30 minutes a day in coding. And across several thousand developers, that's a significant chunk of time. And so people started to look at Git seriously and started to come up with ways that their team could work with Git, unbranded Git servers, and of course Stash. And so enter Stash into that conversation. We had teams that implemented an under-the-desk type solution. Now, I'm not talking literally underneath their desk, but we did have lab environments which consist of servers that are not necessarily highly available. They're not backed up. They could potentially be taken down at any time, and they were doing this to store code. But such was the desire to move to Stash that they wanted to get in there as quickly as possible. We, of course, recognized that this was a bad idea, and our team, which is chartered with supporting and deploying all of the developer collaboration, test, and deployment tools within Expedia, took this charter to build out a Stash implementation that could be supported across the enterprise, was highly available, robust enough to support our developer workload.
So that was about the time that we came in. So they had this one particular team. There were a number of different teams that were already using Git in different capacities. Plus, a lot of the team members were actually working in open source projects or other things that they had going on outside of the Expedia world. So they're already used to working in GitHub and Bitbucket, and they're used to that technology. So we came in, and this one particular team had a pretty sizable Stash implementation in this kind of lab environment, so it wasn't backed up, and it didn't have all these other things that we wanted to have. But other people were taking notice of it. Other teams were taking notice of that instance, and they wanted to get on it. They wanted to start taking advantage of all the things that we're taking advantage of with Git these days, and we're happy to talk about those afterwards if you're curious. We really wanted to take that Stash instance, though, and get it into the ALM team's hands so that they could fully support it. So that was going to take sizing the servers, figuring out what we were going to do for performance, high availability or higher availability, failover, disaster recovery, and start to put all those things in place. Because at the moment, it was just running in a lab environment without being backed up at all. So we wanted to move it out from under that desk and get it into a good, proper environment. So we started off by road mapping what would that plan look like. If you were in the last talk, she was talking about it a little bit. If you were in the Jira Confluence integration class that I taught, we were really hammering on standardization, and that was a big part of the project that we did, was defining what are going to be the standards, how are people actually going to do things, so we can have that consistency and repeatability and the stability in the application. Because really one of our biggest goals in bringing this into the ALM space and having them own it was that their primary responsibility is making the application stable and available for everyone. So after you achieve that, then you can bring in plugins and all the other cool stuff. But if a plugin is going to threaten stability, then it's not worth having. So we focused a lot on the kind of the people side of it. The teams were really excited. Everybody wanted to get into Stash. So we started interviewing all the different teams to find out what did their projects look like, what was their team's skill level, and things like that. Beyond that, just word had gotten out that this group of consultants were coming, and they were the barrier to these teams getting into Stash. So everybody was knocking on our door to introduce themselves and say, hey, just want to make sure you knew that we're here, and we want Git, and we want to get into Stash, and whatever it takes, we would like to be at the beginning of this queue. We also spent a lot of time with the LM team, scoping out the servers and figuring out what was it going to take, how big of a machine did they need, and what sort of infrastructure did they need to support 3,000 developers worldwide. All the continuous integration and other builds are going to be running against it. So that was actually a pretty sizable part of the front end of the project, was all of that planning. Without going too much into the size of the servers and all that kind of stuff, I just want to talk a little bit about the kind of migration paths that we had developed. So we came up with really 3 different processes. One of them, the last one, the Atlassian wrote up a really good article about how to do this. I'll go back to that in just a second, but we just made up names for the other 2. So this atomic cutover, this should be relatively familiar to you. It's a pretty simple process, and it's really the easiest one to do, and whatever you can do to make this be the option that you use, that's really what you should try to do if you go through this migration. So we decided to do an atomic cutover for every group that we could. David talked before about how they've had Perforce for a really long time. They've also have an old code base that was around before we had Bamboo and all of these other tools and Jenkins and continuous integration, build servers, things like that. So a lot of people that have those kind of code bases have these legacy build scripts that they wrote to basically do what all of our deployment tools do these days. And because they were written kind of a long time ago, and we had kind of different practices about how we thought about things, we tend to have these build scripts be very tightly coupled to the version control systems and to the infrastructure that they're working in. So it makes it very difficult to change that infrastructure, change out technologies. And that was really the case that we're in with a lot of these repositories. So for the atomic cutovers, we're interviewing teams and trying to find out, were any of their repositories completely decoupled from all of that other infrastructure? Was there anything that we could do to just cut particular teams over and not have to worry about what their builds look like, where they deploy to, and all the other things that we had to worry about? That was really the most successful and the easiest one. I think that's still the most popular one. There's this piecemeal.
The one we definitely recommend the most.
Yeah. The piecemeal approach was basically the opposite of the Atlassian. In the Atlassian, you take your developers and you keep them in Subversion as long as possible. And you first start mirroring your repositories into Git, so all of the commits to Subversion get pushed over, it get pushed over into Git. Then you move all of your build and dev tools over to Git, and then finally you move your developers over. In Expedia's case, the developers were really, really excited about Git, and the dev tools were very locked into Perforce. So what we did was the opposite. We moved the developers over to Git, and we pushed the code back into Perforce so that all the build tools could still build the way that they used to, and they could still deploy the way that they used to. That allowed us to have time to figure out how we were going to do all that dependency management and move that over into Git eventually, but let the developers start taking advantage of feature branching and all that other stuff.
So one quick point I want to make about the atomic cutover, which I mentioned we definitely recommend in most cases, push for atomic cutover if at all possible. What we like to do with that, and of course, teams are still dependent upon build tools. And even before we started looking at Stash, we had rolled out a self-service model of our build tools where people could go in and write their own build jobs and things like that, right? So the atomic cutover model works really well with that, where we can do what we call sandbox migrating and take a snapshot of the repository from Perforce and allow teams to modify their jobs or build a second job to do exactly what they were doing in Perforce. And so that really has been the most successful model for us, and still allow teams to use their build tools. But we did come up with a solution, let's go ahead and go forward. Yeah. We did come up with a solution for those teams that were dependent upon legacy build scripts. So I mentioned we used Perforce earlier. Perforce has a product called Git Fusion, which is really, really great for working, basically putting a Git front end over your Perforce repositories. And it's highly customizable as to exactly how that Git repository maps to a Perforce folder structure. The nice benefit of using Git Fusion for that is that we can now simply take your Git repository and mirror it to Git Fusion, and those changes end up in Perforce, which are then picked up by our legacy build tools, and off it goes. This is actually also very useful for running migrations. If teams would come to us with various levels of problems or various ways that they wanted to structure their Git repositories. And in a lot of cases, the folder structure in Perforce doesn't necessarily map to a nice Git repository. In these instances, we can take Git Fusion and we can specify that an exact location in Perforce can map to a branch, even a folder within Git. And so when that repository is structured, it'll look exactly like you want it to. It's a really powerful tool. That being said, there are a few limitations with Git Fusion. One is that it doesn't support migrating labels to tags. So of course, there's a utility called Git P4. It ships with most Git implementations. If you've ever used it before, it's a really powerful tool. A little bit more difficult to work with, but there's some very interesting things you can do with Git P4, such as enforcing case insensitivity, and migrating into specific branches and things like that.
Expedia came up with some really amazing technology to support this migration for their developers as well. And I thought that was worth talking about because there's some really, really cool stuff. The first one is this Ivy to Maven bridge. So this was more of a decision that they made internally as opposed to a technological necessity. But they had really an older instance, but they had their instance of Jenkins, which was tied into their common build system, which had this set of old scripts that they were using. It was also using Ivy. In part of the move to Git, they made the decision they were going to set up a clean new environment. So a clean new instance of Jenkins. It was going to be tied to Nexus, and that was what they were going to use for dependency management. So moving to Git also meant changing your builds to move from Ivy to Maven, as well as decoupling yourself from all the P4 dependencies that they had in the common build system. So to kind of help the developers not have to do quite so much work at once, they created this Ivy to Maven bridge, which took all the artifacts that were in Ivy and exposed them in Maven without actually copying them over to it. So it made it a lot easier to make a POM file that could go get dependencies out of Nexus, which were really coming out of Ivy, but also left them the freedom to then leave that stuff behind so that once they actually went through and optimized their builds a little bit more, all these old artifacts that they didn't really need anymore could just be left in Ivy and not brought over to Maven. As part of that, one of their developers also wrote a Ivy build.xml to pom.xml, a Maven POM file converter. So it's just a little script that you would run to take your Ivy build and turn it into a POM. And that probably did a good 80 to 90% of the conversion work for them. So this is some really nice things that the teams have at their disposal to help start cutting themselves out of the old dependencies and moving over to the new infrastructure.
Yeah, the Ivy to Maven bridge has been a really powerful tool for us to, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of decouple certain projects from the monolithic code base, and but still, be able to incorporate those dependencies that aren't yet ready to move over to the new system.
So we did a lot of preparation, and we kind of already talked a little bit about this, but a lot of it was interviewing the teams and kind of assessing their technological readiness as well as the team's readiness itself. So we wanted to look for those cases where we had repositories that didn't have a lot of dependencies, tying them into the old infrastructure, and we had teams that were already used to using Git, already knew how to use it, so there wasn't going to take a lot of training to get them up. Actually, in one of the interviews that we did, this team said, well, we have a bunch of stuff that's tied into the old system, but we've got these chef cookbooks, and they're just scripts, and they just get checked out somewhere. So all we have to do is just update where we're checking them out from. It wouldn't take anything. All right, cool. Well, yeah, we can probably get you scheduled. And the guy just called his team and said, hey, check everything in right now, and then stop working. And they did that. And then 10 minutes later, they were already migrated to Git. They went and checked out again. They started working. That was the first atomic cutover we did, and that was the first cutover we did. I guess we did that one kind of early without planning, but otherwise, we did a lot of planning.
Hey, it's still there. So.
That's true. And it was a good success. It was a good early win. We also used this time to kind of figure out what we wanted for taxonomy. So, Expedia is a really large organization. They're constantly shuffling things around and reorging, and any of you that are from large organizations know that that's what's going to happen. So we didn't want to structure projects and repositories within them in such a way that once they reorg, that's no longer going to make sense or mean anything. So we spent a good bit of time talking to kind of higher ups and lower downs to figure out how we should structure our projects so that they're going to persist. Next up is the implementation. We kind of wanted to talk through some of the testing and challenges and other things that came up as we were actually going through the first migrations.
Yeah, so one of the things that first came up when we started looking at migrations is the fact that people were worried about their code. What's going to happen to my code? Are we going to destroy it or anything of that nature? And the reality is, of course, we're not going to do that. And the fact that VCS is transactional really allows us to just take a snapshot of this code and do a conversion, and then look at it and see what it looks like. Do the number of commits match up? We diffed the code to see, does the code in Git look the same as the code in Stash? We can't actually do a size comparison because any of you that were at Stefan's talk yesterday realized that the Git actually stores the code a little bit more efficiently, and so the size of the repositories is quite a bit smaller than they were in Perforce. Now, this depends on the type of artifact that you're storing in Git, of course, right?
Yeah.
It was really easy to just take a snapshot of the code, see if it looked right. If it doesn't look right, we just delete it, take another snapshot, mess with it, move things around. We did crazy things like rewriting the history in some cases, where people wanted to take their code from Perforce and put it into a subfolder structure, which I actually didn't recommend, but we did it anyway. And really a whole bunch of cool things that we can do offline, perfect it, and then once that's done, pull the diff over from Perforce and then just push it up to Stash, and you're up and running.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the key takeaway is that version control systems are transactional. It's what they're designed to do is like rebuild your code at any point in time. So you can just go, while people are working, not even tell them you're doing it, go take the repository, convert it, stuff it into Stash, and then you can go and migrate over whatever other commits they made along the way as well. And if that looks like it works, well good, now they're migrated, and they can just start using that, and if it doesn't, you throw it away and do it again. And then as David said, we couldn't really just validate the builds by taking like MD5 sums of the two jar files that came out, one from Perforce and one from Git. In this case, largely because we were moving from Ivy to Maven and changing a bunch of other technologies, so we weren't actually spitting out exactly the same binary in every case. But we went through all the testing processes that we could. We ran all of our unit tests and regression tests, and then beat down the doors on everything else that we could. We did run into a handful of challenges along the way that were more kind of infrastructure.
One of the first things that came up as we started moving our build tools to Jenkins and using Git as our source control system was people wanted to use SSH keys. And of course, they wanted to use SSH keys to not only read from the repository, but write back files, or in some cases, write back artifacts, which we tried to encourage them not to do. Our original implementation of Stash was Stash 2.11, which did not support, which only supported read-only machine accounts. Since then, we've migrated to 2.12, which was actually a very easy upgrade, and of course, it supports machine accounts. The other thing that was really kind of an interesting problem was because we are a mixed environment. We have Mac users, we have Windows users, developers on both types of systems. All of the Git clients for Windows use a curl certificate library, and usually they only include the public certificates. Because this is a behind-the-firewall implementation, our Stash server certificate was signed by our internal CA. And of course, anytime users tried to work with Git repositories, Windows users tried to work with Git repositories on our internal Stash server, they would get an SSL error. So we had a couple solutions for that. Obviously, Git supports ignoring SSL verification, which is a really easy solution that may not necessarily be the most secure. Another way we're trying to solve that is by using a publicly signed certificate, but that changes, of course. That would require us to go out to all of our developers who are currently using Stash and have them change their remotes, which, as you'll see a little bit later, is no small task. The other thing was, because we're using an enterprise Linux version, the version of Git that's distributed with the repository, or that's distributed in our Yum repository wasn't up to the standard that is required for Stash. So we did have to build Git from source, which, of course, our security team was concerned about. So we did have to get them to scan it and sign off on it. But so other than having to do that, it was relatively simple. And one of the things that we're still talking about, we haven't quite come up with how we want to do this, is making Stash publicly available, one, so that we can participate in open source products, both consuming and to give back, to contribute back to the community, and also to, going back to the remote developer productivity initiative, ensure those remote developers can access Stash, can do the work that they need without dependency upon, VPN devices and things like that. But of course, we have security concerns around that. We want to make sure that our source code is protected. So these are things that we're still continuing to talk about. And of course, we mentioned the legacy build system and projects that are heavily dependent upon that and haven't moved off of that. We talked a little bit about Git Fusion. We didn't mention that Git Fusion does require a certain version of Perforce or later. We are not on that version for all of our systems. We have several systems. So depending upon where code is stored, we may or may not be able to do that.
There's actually one other one. The last time we were practicing this, we came up with another one that wasn't on the slide deck because we'd already had to submit our final one to it last, and we couldn't change it at that point. But it was actually the single most requested feature of Stash at Expedia, and that was the ability to have custom avatars, because in 2.11, Stash required that you could use Gravatar only, and Expedia had their network set up such that Stash couldn't get to Gravatar, so everybody's had blank white boxes. Everybody wanted custom avatars, but luckily that has now been resolved.
Yeah, that tells you what's important to developers, yeah. So I did mention earlier that our team is responsible for ensuring the tools that we support are highly available and available in the event of a disaster event, which I like to say, somewhat redundant. So how did we implement that? So what we do is we have kind of a tiered backup process, which starts with a cold standby Stash server, which we have in an offsite data center. And that standby server is configured exactly as our production server, but turned down. And our primary method for backup is to both log ship the database and simultaneously rsync the Stash home directory to the cold standby server. And this allows us to theoretically be no more than 15 minutes out of date at any given time if we had to fail over. But because I'm a little paranoid and a little OCD, we do have a second backup method where we actually run the Stash backup client once a week. And we run it once a week, obviously, because you can see it takes about 15 minutes to run based on the size of the total size of the repositories in the Stash server. So we run that once a week now, which isn't good enough for me. So we're going to start looking at Stash DIY backups as well. But our engineers haven't had a chance to look at that yet. That's probably coming up in our next sprint.
So who here has been directly responsible for rolling out some new big technology in their organization? So you know exactly what this feels like. You put a lot of time in planning and everything, but there's that moment like right before you flip the switch. And this is what we found, was that everything went swimmingly. So the migration process, we put a lot of time and effort into it. We planned things, we tested them, We executed to that plan. And I think the other big thing we don't really put on here, but that we did really well was both as Percipio Consulting and Expedia, we communicated with each other really well. But Expedia communicated really well with their development community as well. That was a really big part of it, was having the teams on the same page and knowing what we're doing and ready to do it. And the Git migration was really fun because we were actually taking team by team. So it wasn't quite like some of the big rollouts that we have to do where you're shutting the whole organization down and then bringing them all back up. We were kind of taking these smaller piecemeal steps as well. So with the first successful cutovers, with Stash now having ALM support and being blessed by the organization, and now everybody can get it. At this point, we couldn't keep people away from us. There were literally, someone was in our office 24/7 trying to get into Stash. At this point, David started working, I think, like 27 hours a day, just migrating people over. One other really big piece of this, the human side of the migration is actually a lot harder than the technology side. For the most part, for whatever centralized version control system you're using, going to Git, there's some set of established tools that are out there that you're going to use it. Now, figuring out exactly what that process is for your organization, you got to figure that out. But one bit turning into another bit isn't really the hardest part. The people part is the much harder part. And if you go read Atlassian's blogs on their subversion to Git migration, they talk a lot about that. Those are really, really great articles. And the people side of it is one that I highly recommend. A big part of this was training. We ran a number of training sessions. Anybody that wanted to come was able to come. We weren't really sure what to expect. And what happened was we had to turn people away because we filled the room, and then we let them stand around the perimeter, and then we let them fill in every other little crack and crevice. And then when we couldn't jam any more people in the room, we turned them away and had them come onto the screen share that we were doing as well and work from their desks.
Yeah, that was an interactive tutorial or training, by the way, too. So it was really interesting.
Yeah,
trying to do that with standing.
So then we had this huge room of people just destroying Stash, which it actually stood up to really well, which was really nice. Some really cool things happened at the same time too. So we asked around, who's used Git before? Who's used Git before? So we did this in the training room, and those hands all went up. And we said, all right, well, great. These are now the people that you're going to use to help you through this training class. But I think the bigger thing is that when they go back to their offices, now there's internal champions that people can go to that say, hey, I know I want to do this really cool thing with Git, but I don't know how to do it. Now they have people they can go to.
Yeah, and that's actually really, really powerful for us. As I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of expertise growing up around Perforce, and over time, through attrition, that team of experts got a little bit smaller. And just having Git experts amongst the development community to be able to talk about workflows or go through any complicated scenarios and things like that, it takes the pressure off of us to try to be that Git SME, right? We can focus on being the administration side of Stash and the rest of the tools that we support, and having some of that Git expertise, but also being able to go to experts within our development community. To really talk about the people that are in the trenches doing this every day. Yeah. And the other thing that emerged from that is one of our lead developers was really excited about moving to Git because he'd had some challenges in recruiting with teams or graduates coming out of college being, they're using Git, this is what they're doing every day, and then having to come into a new development environment, having to learn a new tool was less attractive to them. So we definitely, as a technology company, we want to definitely attract the top tier talent coming out of college, and Git is what they're using.
So what's next? Our engagement with Expedia lasted for a little while, and then there's been quite a little while since then that they've been working on. So we wanted to walk you through some numbers of what actually happened. So this is a chart of, so February is when we actually started the project, and we tracked all this information up through just a few weeks ago, actually. So you can see the red line is the onboarding of users in Stash, and it's near linear. So people have been coming on board pretty rapidly. If you notice actually in the last month, though, it's a considerably steeper line. Now that the system is established and kind of proved out, and now that David's team's a little bit bigger and he has a little bit more capacity, they're able to onboard people a lot faster. So it's been really well received within the organization. This is already pushing almost a third of their developers. The projects themselves have been growing at a relatively linear rate as well. And that kind of one of those decisions that we made going back to the taxonomy was trying to figure out how can we organize these projects so that we don't have tons and tons and tons of projects. One of the things that Stash does really, really effectively as well is it allows you to offload administrative tasks to the project administrators, and then even with that, you can go down to repository administrators. But for David's team, they're really concerned with keeping the application stable, with keeping the data sane, making sure that they can recover from a disaster. They don't want to have to deal with giving users access or doing this or that for all the different teams. So by being able to offload all of those responsibilities to the team leads, the teams can run their projects however they want to run them. They have the power to do whatever they need and self-service their projects. And then David's team can really just focus on keeping the application stable and responsive.
Yeah, ironically, just before this talk, I was talking to someone about that exact problem, because traditionally we did apply, we are the super users for Perforce. We do apply all the permissions, and now being able to offload that administrative permission to a dev lead, a team manager, anyone is really, really helpful for us. It reduces that administrative load that we spend dealing with issues and allows us to do more time with improvements and things like that. But one thing I wanted to point out about this slide, if you look at the first couple of months of adoption, these are the users, these are the teams that were knocking down our door prior to Stash implementation. These are the ones that wanted to be the early adopters and get in. And you notice right about April, things tail off just a little bit, but they're still increasing. And then right about in the last month or two, it really takes off. What's really interesting about this is there was not really any type of outreach to customers to say, hey, can you migrate to Stash? Hey, can you migrate to Stash? This is organic adoption in the last month. So these are teams that have heard from other developers, hey, I hear you're in Stash, how's it going? Was it easy to go? All those types of things. And you can see that organic adoption has really taken off. I don't even actually work on migrations anymore. We had to hire another guy to do it. And so he's the one working 27 hours a day, and I'm kicking back with a margarita. So where are we at today? This is actually, it's actually about 3 weeks old. So we're close to 700 Stash users in our instance, which is a huge number. And Stash is humming along great. We'll talk about that a little bit more. 819 repositories. Again, this is 3 weeks old, and yes, you did see that right. We have more repositories than users. So hopefully that's indicative that our code bases, our Git repositories are actually small and lightweight.
I like to just think that developers are working on more than one thing.
And 67 projects.
I think this is the big one. You know, when we had that under the desk implementation, there were just a couple of projects in there, and Stash was humming along just fine. When we went through the scaling effort, there was a very senior network architect who basically spent the whole time grilling me about how this was never going to work. It didn't matter how big we made the server, Stash was just going to fall over instantly. They're up to well over 15 gigabytes of code. I actually rounded this down just to have a kind of round number, but it was like 17 or so. It's probably like 18 or 19 gigabytes of code that they have there now. We don't have a line code count, but that's a lot of code. And really, I mean, how has the onboarding process been performance-wise?
Yeah, it's been fantastic. We have, even just as we were preparing the slide deck, I had users come to us and say, I know you guys are busy, but I know you're not working on Stash because Stash has been great. And Stash has actually been very, very stable for us. It's a product we don't have to worry about at all at this point. And you can see we're well over 700 users. We're well on our way to 20 gigs of code. Again, that's a little bit misleading because the code is the code takes up a little bit more space in Perforce.
But in general, people are really happy. This was it came from the top down. The word got up to the upper levels of Expedia that Git was a great technology, that it'd be a good thing to go for. The developers would save 30 minutes a day by going to it, but the community also really wanted it. So it was one of those kind of rare cases where you get to roll out a technology that everybody wanted and everybody was on board for. So I mean, people were really happy. There was this little bit of a grassroots initiative that teams kind of. I wouldn't go so far as to say they were setting up like rogue servers or anything. They were allowed to do it. And Expedia is actually very good at encouraging their teams to try new things, figure out better ways of working. And when they find those better ways of working, when they find these better processes, then they can start to spread that information throughout the organization. So it's actually a really great thing. But there was this initiative of people that, hey, we want Git. Stash is the tool that won. We tried a bunch of different things, and Stash is the one that we think is going to be the best for the enterprise. And that makes for happy, eager users. Like you said, they didn't do any advertising, and people are onboarding as fast as they possibly can.
So what's next for us? One of the things that we discovered as teams were moving to Stash besides the positive rollout experience and the adoption of Stash, as we've seen already, adoption of other Atlassian tools has actually increased as well. It wasn't long before users were in Stash and they wanted to say, hey, I want my code in Fisheye. I want to be able to index and do code reviews out of Crucible. And so that's really increased as well as adoption of Jira. And what's funny is we actually upgraded to Jira 6.2 recently, not long after we launched Stash. And kind of as we've seen, the development panel has been kind of a really big add-on for Jira. And as teams are seeing that, they're seeing the power of the integration between Jira, Stash, Confluence, and build tools. And this has really increased our Jira adoption as well. So we're having to do a lot more planning around capacity for all of the Atlassian tools, all cascading from this launch of Stash.
I know you've seen a lot of things in the keynotes here about the integration between the different tools. We spent an entire day with anybody at Expedia that wanted to come, and we set up all of the Atlassian tools, integrated them all together, and showed how you can take a product requirements document and use that to create all of your stories, which get dumped into your backlog, and you can prioritize those, create a sprint, start working on them, create a branch from there, go do your work on that, merge it up through a pull request, or go do a Fisheye or a Crucible review on it. It automatically gets picked up by Bamboo and built. All that stuff gets shown in the development panel. And that just makes that issue in Jira become the central place to go for everything that's ever happened on that. And then if you're using Git flow or something like that, then you have the ability to track every single change that went into each release. It becomes a lot easier, especially if you're using something like feature branching or issue branching. If you have an issue that's tracking it, then you know every single issue that went into your next release. It makes that traceability much, much easier to manage.
Yeah, so what's stuck with us throughout this whole process? Stash, getting it up and running was really, really, really easy to use, and of course our partners at Percipio helped us build a solution that was very robust and repeatable, which is always good. And it's been really, really stable for us. And as those of you that were at the Stash keynote and at Stefan's talk yesterday might have heard, Stash does, or Git at some point will tip over. We actually haven't reached that yet. So the message bar that comes up that when you have too many processes queued, we've never actually seen that. So we do have a ton of robots also hitting our Stash server, mostly index requests from Fisheye, but we do have a number of clone operations as well. So all those pack jobs that Stefan was mentioning, we do have that, and we've had no performance issues whatsoever. So we haven't hit that magic number yet. I don't know where it is, but I can tell you it's not at 700 users. So what else did we find out? We found out that however you want to structure your repository, we can do it. This may not always be a good thing, as I've said a couple of times now, but we do make it work for you. And there was a little bit of a paradigm shift for users coming from Perforce and expecting to see somewhat of a folder structure in Git and trying to rip apart those repositories into individual modules. But we make it work for them, and when the time comes to move some of that code into smaller, more modular bits, we can certainly assist with that as well. But the key takeaway there is that we can meet the developer needs. And if we can't, or if we don't know what to do, there's tons and tons of community support around Git. When I came into this, I was not a Git expert by any means. I'd used Git before, but I'd never taken code from Perforce to Git. And I found it really, really easy to get up and running. I found the documentation, the community support to be very helpful. Mm-hmm. And lastly, just understanding that Git is really where everything is going right now. This is where our developers want to go, both the new developers that we're bringing onto our teams and the developers that are already working for us.
So I was kind of curious, how many of you are either in the process of or are starting to think about migrating from some other version control system to Git, either to Stash or to something else?
Wow.
Wow. That's more than I expected. That's great. I think we all learned a lot from this project. This was a really fun, great project to get to do. It wasn't nearly as painful as everybody thought it was going to be going into it. That's all we have for the presentation part of it.
Thanks, guys. That was awesome.